Hello and welcome to Pit Talk, a Fox Sports and Speed Cafe Formula One podcast. On today's episode, Sergio Pérez crashes out of his home Grand Prix in a clumsy crash at the first corner of the first lap. Daniel Ricciardo, though, finishes a very competitive 7th on a big day and weekend for AlphaTauri, and it's all putting the driver market, and in particular, the Red Bull program, back in the spotlight with 3 rounds to go. My name's Michael Laminato, motorsport writer for Fox Sports Australia. It's great to have your company and the company of my co-hosts from Speed Cafe. He's heard of zero alcohol tequila and he's not interested. It's Matt Kosh.
One tequila is enough for me. You just notch it up one and I'm on the floor.
And also from Speed Cafe, he's now mostly taco after a week in Mexico. It's Ian Parks.
Where do you get these puns? Really? Seriously? Do you think I'll use up a lot of your day trying to work these out? It's
a good hour of work. I'd be disappointed if you... all I know from my experience going to this Grand Prix is there are a lot of free tacos available in the paddock. So if you're not, I will be disappointed in you.
This is actually very true.
Yeah, so it's just, it's a bit of scene setting, guys. It's just a bit of light-hearted banter to start. Do them straight next week. Look, guys, the talking point of this week, there were 2 major ones. You're not going to be surprised, anyone listening, to hear that it's related to Sergio Pérez and Daniel Ricciardo. They were the talking points of this race, even on a record-breaking day for Max Verstappen. But because it was his own record that he broke, we don't really have to talk about it. Could have talked about it last year. Let's start with the Sergio Pérez angle, though, because as we mentioned last week, big weekend for him. Obviously, the home race aspect was always going to be a big weekend, but the pressure continues to mount on Sergio Pérez despite having a contract next year. His inability to close out second in the Drivers' Championship does seem to be weighing on Red Bull Racing. A very clumsy first lap crash underlined all of those issues. But Matt, it struck me that actually up until that point in the weekend, a very crucial point in the weekend, mind you, when all the points were on the line, it did feel like Perez's insistence that he turned a bit of a corner in the last couple of weeks for his understanding in the car did seem to be kind of accurate. Relatively close in qualifying, reasonably competitive in practice. Are we overblowing the first quarter crash if you can do such a thing in the broader context of this closing part of the season?
I don't think you can, but you've hit the nail on the head when you say clumsy. Yes, he was closer to Max Verstappen, but that doesn't mean it was good. It's where, that's the expectation. That's where he should be. He's done the job. He's done nothing more than that, which, contrasts the fact that he hasn't been doing the job. Yes, he crashed out while arguably battling for the lead at turn 1, but as he said himself, he sort of put himself in a position where he was at risk. Max Verstappen said the same thing in the post-race press conference, that he didn't use so many words, but he sort of inferred that it was a little bit of desperation on Sergio's part, in that he was so desperate to get to the front in front of a home crowd, all this pressure on him, all this chatter in the paddock that just doesn't go away, despite him reassuring that he's got a contract for next year, the team reassuring that fact, this isn't going away, that's got to be weighing on him. There's all sorts of rumours that are now flying around that he's going to IndyCar and all sorts of things. So it was clumsy. He didn't need to put himself there. He's got a car that would have easily cruised by Leclerc anyway. We know that Ferrari is hard on tyres, and we know that Sunday's race was tyre management dominated to an extent. Why put yourself in that position? Open the steering a little bit, cede a place or two, knowing that you're going to get it back. It was desperate stuff of a driver that's under extreme pressure. And Ian, I know you spoke to him post-race, but that's certainly what I got from his comments, that he realised that.
Yeah, but you're also missing the key point as to why he did that. And it wasn't just to get past Charles Leclerc. It was actually to get in the lead of the race and to have Max behind him. Because he obviously, I'm guessing, would have known that if he hadn't made a move around Leclerc, but Max had been ahead of him, he wouldn't have had a cat in hell's chance of getting past Max. He was going for the lead. He was going for the win. Those were his words in the pen afterwards. And you could see he was gutted. He was absolutely devastated by what had happened. And I'm wondering what the emotional and psychological repercussions of this are going to be on him. He said he's going to be fine. Christian Horner said he's a warrior and he'll bounce back. But this was the big one for him. This was the one where he knew He had to make a statement, and in his own words, he risked it all and paid the price. Is there a bigger penalty to pay? I don't think so. And the reason why I don't think so are for 3 reasons. 1, Claro. 2, Telcel. 3, Intel.mx. Those are his big sponsors. Now, you've got to think this through logically, and this is the point I'm going to make, that they pay huge money to back Sergio Perez. Red Bull has contracts in place with each of those 3 major Sergio Perez sponsors. So if they decided to get rid of Sergio, they've got to somehow cut up the contracts with those 3. And I don't think there would likely be the escape clauses, which is why there was all this constant talk about Sergio is there for next year, he's there for next year, he's there for next year. Christian reiterated again on Sunday night. Even if Sergio doesn't finish second in the championship, should Lewis Hamilton overtake him, as Christian pointed out, it's not as binary as that. There is still a contract in place. And as far as they're concerned, they are with him through next season.
Without wanting to preempt, we're going to talk a little bit about the driver market more broadly or in the Red Bull context in a moment. But tell me a little bit, Ian, about the pressure he was under in the home crowd aspect. We hear a lot about how he is feted as a national hero in Mexico, and certainly the crowd is vociferously pro-Sergio Perez and anti-everybody else if they happen to tangle with him, as Charles Leclerc learned afterwards. Do you think we can divide up what happened on Sunday between the pressure he's under this season in a general sense, because he's underperformed for so much of the year in that car, compared to that need to perform for his home crowd? Was this actually the wrong time for him to need a big performance being at home rather than the right time to do it?
I think he's been running on fumes for quite a while anyway this season. Ever since, we've discussed this before, and I've mentioned this before as well, ever since the Miami Grand Prix, when he was on pole, Max started 9th, Max won the race. He's not been the same driver. Something up there has been eating away at him, and Max has just done a number on him like he has done on all of his previous teammates. So when it comes to Checo and his home Grand Prix, this, as I said, this was the big one for him. This was the one where he really wanted to perform. And the passion of the crowd in Mexico is supremely different to anything I've ever experienced. From my perspective as a British journalist, Lewis Hamilton at the British Grand Prix. I'm sure from the perspective of you 2 guys, Daniel Ricciardo, and the Aussie Grand Prix, and obviously going forward, Oscar. This isn't just passion. This is fervour from the crowd. They're chanting his name everywhere, and that has to weigh on you at some point. I don't think any other driver with any other home Grand Prix has the kind of clamour and pressure on his shoulders as Sergio Perez does going into the Mexican Grand Prix, or Mexico City Grand Prix, as I should give it its correct title.
It's sort of shades of Mansell Mania back in the early 90s, wasn't it? When the crowd invaded Silverstone and all that sort of stuff. It's crazy, and it really goes to show when Sergio says it was the saddest moment of his Formula One career, of his racing career. He's dejected. How you pick yourself up from that and carry on is interesting. Ian, I take your point on the sponsorship side of things, and I just wonder what value does Red Bull put on success? Because if Sergio Perez carries this form into 2024 and the chasing pack proves to be closer to Red Bull, it can't afford a passenger. It needs a driver who's going to deliver. Sergio currently isn't that driver. And what does Red Bull value more? The sponsorship deals that are signed that will likely have penalties if it tries to break those, or success in the World Championship? That for me is the question.
You could argue that, they've won this World Championship a long time ago, as we all know. I mean, Max has scored more points on his own than any other team in the Constructors' Championship, and that says it all. The one thing they do want for the first time is a 1-2 in the Drivers' Championship. They've never done that in their history. So they are desperate to get Checo over the line this season with these final 3 Grand Prix. Sprint races we know as well, the last one of the season coming up in Sao Paulo. But, I mean, Michael, from your perspective, what do you make of this whole saga? I mean, are you on Checo's side? As Matt's mentioned, there's rumours about is it going to IndyCar as well? I mean, I don't believe that, but it's a lovely rumour to have. We'll knock that one about on here. What about you, Michael? What's your thoughts?
I like rumours to IndyCar are the equivalent of breakaway series in Formula One history, I think. So I'd put limited stock in that kind of thing. I'll be on the record as saying I like Sergio Pérez in Formula One. Ever since as a younger man, I was mistaken for his cousin at the Australian Grand Prix at a party I wasn't at. I've had a soft spot for Sergio. So I do have a soft spot for him. The element that I find interesting is the psychological one, but not just on the driver side, because I think this weekend, him bouncing back from it is going to be the biggest test, because it has been such a low moment for him. But you mentioned there as well, this battle for second in the Drivers' Championship is also psychological from the team's perspective. The fact that Red Bull could never achieve the 1-2 in the Vettel-Webber era when the car was also pretty dominant, but especially in Vettel's hands, in a way that I almost want to say it was a less dominant car than it is now, but Vettel was getting much more out of it than Verstappen is at the moment, if that makes sense. I'm not saying Verstappen's not getting a lot out of this car, but it was almost just like a car built for Vettel in a more extreme way than I think it is for Verstappen at the moment. If they can't get a 1-2 with this car, that should be almost like an all-rounder performer that most other drivers would certainly back themselves to get that second position in, I think that also becomes a psychological blow for the team, because if they can't do it this year, when will they achieve that last checkbox? Because we've got to hope collectively that next year they're not going to be in as dominant a position. And then a driver like Lewis Hamilton or maybe Lando Norris from McLaren or whoever will be in a much easier position to snatch second or potentially even go for the Drivers' Championship and the story changes again. I think if Sergio can't do it for him and then he can't do it for the team, I think that's a potentially a much deeper blow to that relationship than just simple underperformance. Because realistically, in the last half of the season, that's all they've been going for. Both championships have been effectively sewn up and then were sewn up. This is the only motivation left. And to feel a loss this season, which is what it will be like, I think would be pretty deep. So I think there is a lot riding on that second place, even if it's not, as Christian Horner's insisted, as you said, Ian, a line in the sand in a contractual sense. I think there's still going to be a lot to come from that, because that'll be a pretty deep burn, I think, for the team. And I think that becomes a really major talking point as we head into November.
I think one of the main comments that I heard coming out of the weekend as well was a very astute one from Lewis Hamilton in the press conference yesterday, post-race press conference. And he was asked, well, the gap's 20 points now. Do you think you can catch Checo? And he basically turned around and said, well, that's down to him. He's in the championship winning car. It was like, boom. Yeah. That really nails it on the head. From Lewis's perspective, that Red Bull, he has been blown away in by Max Verstappen this season. And Sergio Pérez effectively should have done exactly the same thing race after race and hasn't done. That's going to be eaten away at not only Checo, but all those inside Red Bull as well. Because they should be they should have wrapped up 1-2 a long time ago. They haven't. These last 3 Grand Prix are going to be huge for Sergio Pérez.
So, I want to ask you, you were on the ground, because the other critical element of this is, of course, the Daniel Ricciardo element. Because Sergio Pérez would have been under pressure anyway, but the fact that there is this pressure from below, which is the way Red Bull, to be fair, has always set up its driver program, but there's a sort of ready-made alternative, it seems like, pushing up from AlphaTauri. Daniel Ricciardo had a really great weekend. His first great weekend of the season. He's only had 4, but it was a really good weekend for his season. His comeback, second race since returning from his broken hand. Looked really confident from everything I saw, even turning up on Thursday, which is pretty remarkable considering he finished a lap down and last in the United States Grand Prix, admittedly with damage as we talked about last week. What was your perception of Daniel on the ground this weekend in Mexico City, and was it all just confidence?
Just exuding out of every pore. It was remarkable. You could see on Friday post-practice, when a few of us were there speaking to him, that beaming Daniel Ricciardo smile that he's obviously renowned for was back. And he knew it. he could feel it. He very confidently said after practice, I've got a car for top 10 in qualifying. He said, if I'm lucky, top 6. I don't think anybody in their wildest dreams, not even Daniel Ricciardo when he went to bed last night, dreamed he was going to be 4th on the grid. Splitting the Red Bulls and AlphaTauri beating a Red Bull. When we've just talked about Checo, that's another dagger to the heart there, isn't it? To have an AlphaTauri ahead of him, and not just an AlphaTauri ahead of him, but the guy he knows wants his seat for 2025. We know many people want Sergio Pérez's seat for Daniel for 2025, but for Daniel, he's made that his stated aim. He's already gone on record as saying he wants to be back at Red Bull in 2025. He could not have had or not have made a bigger statement of intent than he did across the Mexico City Grand Prix weekend.
I think let's put this in a broader context here, because yes, it was a standout performance, but it does far more than just put Daniel on a radar that he was already a blip on. He lifted AlphaTauri off the foot of the Constructors' Championship. That's worth huge amounts of money. That's what he was brought in to do. He put Yuki Tsunoda in the shade. We'll speak about Yuki a little bit later, I'm sure. But he delivered like nobody else in that car all season. Not even Liam Lawson, as good as he was. Daniel delivered like nobody else has all season long. That's the sort of thing that impresses not only us, but that's the sort of thing that impresses Franz Tost, Christian Horner, Helmut Marko, because that's what they need from him. Now, we're building it up as a big result, and realistically, it's what drivers are paid to do. They go out there and deliver what the car is capable of. The car was clearly capable of 4th on Saturday. He delivered that. It was capable of points on Sunday. He delivered that. Potentially, it was worth a little bit more, but he very maturely didn't throw it away while battling with Lando Norris. And for the record, how good was that pass of Lando Norris's? But he also didn't throw it away when battling with George Russell on the final lap for another 2 points. And that extra 2 points would be huge. The 6 points that Daniel scored was massive, because they're now tied with Sauber for 9th in the championship, which basically means that the AlphaTauri is 8th on countback. But those extra 2 points, with the top 10 so hard to crack for the teams at the bottom end, that 2 points almost would have sealed 8th in the championship for it. So the drive to risk it all, to score that and to try and secure that for the team would have been enormous. And he had to go, but within acceptable boundaries, didn't throw it away, came home with 6 points and looked like a superstar, delivered the team the best result of the season. It's exactly why Red Bull put him in that car, to deliver those composed, mature results and drive the team forward. Job done with a massive tick in my book.
I think one of the biggest aspects about Daniel came from not Daniel himself, but a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Eddles, who is AlphaTauri's trackside engineering director. We spoke to him on the Sunday morning, and he was basically asked what's happened to transform Daniel from the Austin Grand Prix weekend. Part of it's the car. Let's make no bones about that. That AlphaTauri runs well at Mexico. It just ran even better on this occasion with Daniel at the wheel. But basically, the bottom line from Jonathan was that they've managed to work with Daniel Ricciardo's quite unique driving style. And they've managed to unlock in 4 Grand Prix what McLaren failed to do in 2 seasons in working with Daniel. He has a very unusual style, and they've managed to marry his style with the car. They've got the car to work for him. Whereas McLaren, as we know, with the exception of that anomalous result that Daniel scored in the Italian Grand Prix, his victory there, on every other occasion, in particular his second season, which as we know was awful, they just could not get the car to work for him. Now, no matter what they tried with Daniel, it didn't work. And obviously that's why he was terminated a year ahead of schedule. And that's why he's now ended up where he is, pushing for the Red Bull seat, as we know, in 25. But he's got this unique style in terms of his braking, in terms of getting his car to rotate through the corner. And we saw that. He was at home in that car. And post-race, again, he was just bubbling with enthusiasm. And the key aspect from Jonathan, it was obviously asked of him, well, is this just a one-off because it's your car that's so good at this circuit? And he turned around and said, actually, no, I think we've got it now, even for these next 3 races. Daniel's at home in that car. He feels like he's at home. They've made setup tweaks as well in between Austin and Mexico City that have really worked. So that bodes well for AlphaTauri going into these last 3 races and Daniel going into these last 3 races as he continues to push for what he really, really wants in 2025.
I think there's also an element here worth remembering with Mexico City too, and it does feed into why Daniel's probably always been good here without it sort of underwriting or underestimating this particular good performance. It's such a management race. Experience counts for a lot here in the thin atmosphere. Tyres slide way more and they overheat way more. It's really easy to overdrive. We see that often at the end of Q3 laps, for example. Lando Norris had a little bit of a snap in Q1 even when he was trying to get out of Q1 through that stadium section, by which time the tyres starting to overheat a little bit. It's quite a demanding section in terms of traction because it's so fiddly and slow, very easy to overcook that. And then in the race, you multiply that essentially by 71 times, very easy to burn up the tyres. Brake cooling, engine cooling. There's a lot of management required to balance those demands and still be fast. I think actually Lando Norris ironically demonstrated that extremely well. Then on Sunday, showed the worst of it and then the best of it on 2 consecutive days. He managed that balance so well to cut through the field. Daniel Ricciardo being so consistently at that level, let's call it 5th in the Grand Prix before the red flag and then sort of 7th afterwards, was just managing the pace so well that I think really underscored how good he is at managing the race. And that comes with race experience, of course, but not every driver is as good as that. And I think if you're either AlphaTauri or Red Bull, in both these circumstances, you're looking at that and going, he's still got that racecraft in it. And if the pace is now there, there's not a lot left in the overall package when you're assessing how much of his original potential he could still recapture in these next however many years of his career is going to last. We're talking about him like he's a much older driver than he is, actually. Theoretically, if he's back there, he could race for a very long time. But I think that's what's more encouraging than just the pace. It was that in the race, he was so solid in a way that, even in the United States before the damage, still a little bit unsure about how well he was going to go, including and then in Hungary and Belgium, it was sort of a little bit up and down. That stability was very encouraging. And I think if you're a Daniel Ricciardo fan hoping he's going to go on to bigger things again, I think that's what makes it a little bit more exciting than even that Monza result, because there was a lot in this to unpack from his overall performance.
Jonathan,
it's
sorry.
interesting. Go for it. You're on the ground. You've got the advantage.
You speak after me. I've got some good insight into that, and again, it came from Jonathan regarding the Austin weekend. So obviously Daniel had those first 2 Grand Prix back. He was even going into the race at Zandvoort, the Dutch Grand Prix. Daniel admitted himself that in second practice, he was on the hard tyre, and just before his crash, he was really starting to feel comfortable with the car. As we all know, unfortunately, he had that crash, took him out for 5 Grand Prix. So what happened in Austin is that, obviously, in the intervening period, AlphaTauri had developed its car. So going into the one and only practice session, basically, Daniel's car was given the same setup as Yuki because they didn't know which way to go because the car had evolved. So unfortunately, they got that baseline and it didn't work for Daniel because they only had the 1 practice session. If they'd have had the 2nd and 3rd, then they might have found a setup that would have worked for him. So that's why he went into that sprint race, into the Grand Prix, just a little uncomfortable, basically because he was on Yuki's setup. And obviously then, you can't make setup changes after, because the cars are in Parc Fermé after the sprint qualifying on Friday evening. So that's why he was a little bit off. And that's why in between Austin and Mexico City, they made numerous setup changes to that car that got Daniel supremely comfortable in it. And that's why he delivered the weekend he did in Mexico City. Just as an addendum, just before Matt has his say on this, I know I said that Jonathan Edels remarked that this is it now going forward for these 3 races, that they're not expecting to fall back. just to add, do not expect Daniel Ricciardo to qualify fourth in the next race in Brazil or in Las Vegas or in Abu Dhabi, but expect him to at least be pushing for a Q3 top 10 again. Over to you,
So
Matt.
we won't expect fourth. We'll expect third, second, and then pole in Abu Dhabi. Yeah. That's the way I can feel this ramping up here. That's probably a little bit facetious, just a touch.
But keep watching. Keep watching.
Yeah, absolutely. Stay tuned in. It's not just the Max Verstappen show anymore. We've got something that's, particularly for us here, really now quite absorbing for me anyway, because we're talking as though Yuki Tsunoda doesn't exist. Here's the guy that in his third season was hypothetically the team leader of AlphaTauri at the start of the year. Arguably ended Nick de Vries' career after 10 races. We all thought that was pretty brutal. But you look at what Daniel's done, and to an extent Liam as well, against Yuki Tsunoda across the last 9 races or so. And Tsunoda hasn't impressed. I'm going to say it right now. Tsunoda hasn't impressed. And I think he had possibly the worst Mexico City Grand Prix imaginable for him, and I'll explain why. He started at the back. That wasn't his fault. That was just reliability and the engine penalties and all that sort of stuff. That's what it is. He then drove quite well. Yes, he was off sequence and he benefited from the red flag and all that sort of stuff, but he was still there. He put the car in the right position and he was making progress. He had that AlphaTauri in a position where he and Daniel, just a little bit further up the road, could deliver far beyond Frantos' wildest dreams. Imagine Daniel finishes 6th and Yuki 8th. That's huge points for a team that's been rooted to the foot of the Constructors' Championship. And then Yuki makes a stupid move on Oscar Piastri. Twice. And I say it's stupid. Yes, he was racing. Yes, there were racing incidents. But he was in the points. There's a bigger game to play here. This isn't about taking that position off Oscar Piastri. This is about delivering for the Constructors' Championship, ensuring that the team is secure and safe going forward, impressing the bosses, showing them that you can do the job. If you're given an opportunity in a front-running car, you need to go out there and deliver. If you're going to drive alongside Max Verstappen, you have to accept that you're going to be second best. You have to go out there and take the maximum that's on offer without throwing the car away. And in Mexico, he threw the car away twice. He risked it. He risked it at turn 2 when he made contact with Oscar. And then a couple of laps later, yes, again, it was a racing incident, but he put his car in a position where he banged wheels and ended up in the weeds. He went home without any points, and that's absolutely inexcusable for a driver of his experience, for a driver in that position in a car that by rights for the season thus far shouldn't be in that position. He threw that result away. And that is why Red Bull has brought Daniel in. And that is why we're talking about Daniel versus Yuki as a potential replacement for Sergio Pérez. Because Yuki Tsunoda, I'm sorry, he's not good enough. He's a very good Formula One driver and he's got a fine career ahead of him. He's certainly fast enough. But he's not a world champion in my opinion, and he doesn't deserve a Red Bull drive based on what we've seen over the 9 races and that little micro analysis that we got of him versus Daniel in Mexico. So, yeah, he had a disastrous Mexico Grand Prix when he could have looked actually very, very good.
I'd like to move, guys, that we institute a new segment called Matt Spray. Can we do that? Sorry,
I was going to say, we've heard the case against there. Is there any defence, Michael? Have you got anything to go on?
There is no defence. It was that bad, there's no defence. What can he possibly say to redeem himself from that? He threw away 8th in the championship.
Oh, this is
I think it's very interesting.
Run.
Yeah, listening to the prosecution, I thought it was very interesting that you could actually make all the same arguments against Sergio Pérez, couldn't you? I mean, there was a broader play, which was second in the Constructors' Championship. Points not really important except for him, not for the team. But as a team goal, threw it away at the first corner, showed he had reasonable speed in the race, well, not in the race, Sergio Pérez's case, but over the course of the weekend, and wasted it all on an overly ambitious move. And very much the same for Yuki Tsunoda, except arguably, yeah, I mean, it's worse because he'd put in such a good race up until that point. He'd earned a lot of those positions and would have earned the 2 or 4 points or whatever it was at the time. I think it was before Lando Norris came through. Yep. And then threw those points away. Threw his hard work away. I think that's almost, in a sense, worse and more indictable. And I think like I've often been pro Yuki Tsunoda because of the speed, and I think it's always that situation where you can kind of chisel out the mistakes if you've got that speed. You've always got potential if you've got that inherent speed, and I think that's still true to an extent. But the Red Bull program has historically been a 3-year tops program, right? I know Pierre Gasly kind of broke that, and probably if you accumulate all of Daniel Kvyat's races, he probably broke that as well. But generally, it's a 3-year program, and if you can't cut out those mistakes after 3 years in the highest pressure situations like this, when you've got a lot of points on the line, that is rough. And to be fair, he's made relatively few mistakes this year, and some of those reliability problems he had at actually the team's best races, so we might be talking about a bigger points haul for him this year. But yeah, I mean, when you're up against Daniel Ricciardo, that shows what the Red Bull program can deliver in a complete driver, admittedly with many years more experience, but nonetheless, that it is a damning contrast. And I think if potentially in a couple of months, maybe, we might be talking about this race as being really decisive in the Red Bull driver program in terms of the Red Bull lineup. I think we might also be saying something similar about Yuki Tsunoda.
And on the back of that as well, one of the very reasons that they brought Daniel back in was for his experience, his know-how, his knowledge in setting up a car, his how to feed back to engineers. Start of this season, Yuki Tsunoda got 2 years experience on Nick de Vries. Okay, still relatively young in Formula One terms, but if they couldn't rely on Yuki to act as kind of a team leader, as Matt has rightly pointed out, what does that say about him going forward, if he is ever to go forward from this position? That Red Bull quite clearly now don't see him as someone that could progress into their team. He'd get destroyed by Max Verstappen without a shadow of a doubt. He hasn't. Matt's right. He hasn't. For me, he hasn't got the talent to be at Red Bull. He's at the level he's at, as far as I'm concerned, and he's not going to progress. He's very lucky that he's got next season. I think very, very lucky. But I think it could be his last in Formula One if he doesn't show any great signs of improvement or progression. And I think we all know, because it's been mentioned by both Christian and I think Helmut, that Liam Lawson is looking good for one of the 2 seats in AlphaTauri come 2025. So what that means for Yuki, who knows?
Look, we're getting close to time, so I kind of want to end on a question here, because the question that's almost we haven't asked explicitly is about what's going to happen with the driver lineup, right? And the answer is no one's sure, because it's Red Bull. You can never be sure what they're going to do with their drivers. Maybe they swap them next year. Maybe it's the middle of next year. Maybe Sergio
Christian
Pérez
Klein comes back.
You don't know, do you, man? You just don't know. But there's an interesting sort of sub-question here, which is specifically about AlphaTauri. We know Yuki Tsunoda is going to be there next year. On paper, Daniel Ricciardo is going to be there next year. But let's assume for a second that Daniel is moved up and Sergio doesn't want to step down to AlphaTauri. I don't think that's unimaginable in that context. We get Liam Lawson. That's all great. But what about AlphaTauri in the bigger picture? Because this year, even in the last couple of rounds, or the last couple of rounds that Daniel's been in the car, they've really relished having a very experienced driver there. And it feels like, while the car's been developed a reasonable amount this year, it's kind of taken Daniel to actually realise its potential. Of the evidence of one round, admittedly, but let's just say that is a microcosm of where that team is. What does that say about, and where does that leave AlphaTauri if Daniel goes to Red Bull Racing? They have Yuki Tsunoda, who we've all decided is maybe not really quite team leadership material, even if he's fast. And they bring in Liam Lawson, who's very good, but will essentially still be a rookie next year. Does that not just put a really hard ceiling on a team that in recent years Red Bull's really tried to insist is not a junior team, but a sister team? And doesn't that kill the morale a little bit at AlphaTauri, having seen what is possible but may never be possible?
Well, Matt.
I think having Yuki there next year, regardless of what happens at the senior team, is a good move. Which really contradicts what I've just ranted about.
But the defence has arrived. This is good. Yeah.
the reason being is he's a known benchmark. If you throw the baby out with the bathwater, you bring in, let's say, Liam Lawson and Isaac Hadjar, who was in action in Mexico in free practice 1. You don't know anything about those drivers comparatively. Okay, they know a little bit about Liam, but fundamentally they know nothing about him. They don't necessarily know how to drive a car forward. They don't have that comparative data. They've got that with Yuki. They've got a benchmark there. And I wonder if that's the model going forward, where rather than looking to compete two young drivers against one another for a Red Bull drive, they put perhaps a driver that's more senior, potentially even, let's say in 4 years' time, Daniel's on his way back out, move him back to AlphaTauri or whatever that team will be called that season, use him then as the reference for the young gun alongside him so that you've got that benchmark of comparison. Because I think that's the problem they're in. They've got Yuki Tsunoda, who looked really good. And then he's against a driver that is a known benchmark and he doesn't look so good anymore. So in a normal season, you'd have promoted Yuki Tsunoda at some point and you'd have got him to Red Bull and suddenly discovered that he's actually not as good as you thought he was because you didn't have that reference. So by having Tsunoda there next year or even the year after, depending how things shake out, you've got that reference. You know exactly how good Liam Lawson is. If Liam comes in and starts destroying Tsunoda, yeah, Liam is ready to move up. If he comes in and he's only matching Tsunoda, got a few questions to answer still. I think that's probably the safer bet moving forward. Formula One has moved on from the point where you can just sort of throw mud at a wall and find out what sticks. You've got to be more scientific about it these days because you can't afford to take risks at the front end of the grid. It's just too close these days. The financial regulations and everything else have just conspired to reduce that gap. Yes, Red Bull's running away with it, but if you actually look at the relative gap between Red Bull and the teams that are chasing it, it's still actually quite small versus what there's been in Formula One history. So the field is close. You can't take those big risks anymore. So Red Bull needs to change its model, in my opinion, and that's where Yuki Tsunoda fits in. He's a journeyman, a really good journeyman.
Matt had just pretty much sacked Yuki Tsunoda about 10 minutes ago, and now he's just saved him. Pulled him back from the brink.
If I was Christian Horner, I'd have sacked him. If I was Franz Tost, I'd have said, we're not going to give you a pay raise, but you're safe for another year.
Maybe that's what they've done anyway.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation, but the Red Bull driver market always is. The Red Bull driver program is always a fascinating environment, I think it's fair to say. And it does feel like it's building up to another moment. We just don't know when that moment is going to be.
Or what that moment is.
To be fair, we don't know what that moment is. Max Verstappen is going to resign. Who knows? Could be anything. We'll learn a little bit more this weekend in Brazil, of course, where all eyes will be on Sergio Pérez to bounce back and whether Daniel Ricciardo can continue this run of form. And we'll be back next week to wrap up the Sao Paulo Grand Prix, because it is another race weekend this weekend. 3 in a row. Live everywhere all the time. That's that old sketch? Each more climactic than the last, each race. You can subscribe to Pit Talk wherever you get your favourite podcasts, or you can watch the podcast on YouTube. Just search for Fox Sports Australia. And you can follow updates all this weekend at both foxsports.com.au and speedcafe.com. Until next week, from Matt Kosh, Ian Parks and me, Michael Laminato, we'll catch you next time.